paragraph. Go ahead and sign up at the registration table before about 4:30 today. Now I'm going to invite Emily Grosvenor up to introduce our afternoon keynote. Emily is a journalist and editor of Oregon Home magazine. She joined the committee 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, and until this year was our youngest member, bringing us phrases like, "That's my jam," and "right?" Emily is the one responsible for the Terroir blog, for email updates and Facebook posts. She is the behind-the-scenes face behind the face of Terroir.
So years ago, I read this essay in Oregon Humanities magazine by an author who was previously unknown to me. Her name was Courtenay Hameister. This essay told a story about how a bout with anxiety made her decide to stop doing something that she had become somewhat famous for. At the time, I think Courtenay was actually at the front end of what has now kind of become like a failure story. So like a moment when you do, something happens to you and you have to stop doing something and you decide to say something publicly about that beyond, I'm going to go spend more time with my family.
That's if you get fired.
Exactly. So now, I've always understood anxiety as most writers do, which is to say personally. But Courtney's essay really struck me and it really stuck with me all those years later. So when her book came out, which is Okay, Fine, Whatever, which is for sale over in the lobby, by the way, I rushed to buy it. It was one thing to remember being public about anxiety. It's another thing to know that people will always remember funny, right? So flash forward a couple years, Courtney's here to speak with us today, and hopefully to sign a couple more copies of her book, and to talk about, are you going to talk about the experience of that book? She might have something completely different to talk about.
Yeah, well, I'm going to talk about sort of what I did in order to write it, but I won't talk kind of about the actual.
Okay, well, I am going to offer no spoilers on that then. Like in my house, sometimes they call me spoilers, so I'm not going to do that today. So Courtney's a real hero to me, and I am so pleased and honored to be able to introduce her to you today. Ladies and gentlemen, Courtenay Hameister.
So yeah, just to give you, you already have a little bit of a background on me, but just to kind of give you a little bit more detail. So I, for 9 years, I was the host and head writer of Livewire, which is a radio variety show that records in Portland in front of a live audience. And so I did that, like I said, I hosted the show for about 9 years, and then I was the head writer and producer for the next 3 after I stepped down from host. I also have generalized anxiety disorder and intrusive thought OCD. And what that means is when you have intrusive thought OCD, people who have OCD tend to have intrusive thoughts, but they act on them. Like, oh, I'm going to get a lot of germs from this, so I'm going to keep washing my hands. But if you just have sort of intrusive thought OCD, you just have the thoughts. You just have these constant intrusive thoughts that you can't control. And they tend to be, there's different versions of it. There's harm OCD, which I had and continue to struggle with, where you think you've either hurt someone or are going to hurt someone. There's sexual intrusive thought OCD, where you think you're doing something inappropriate sexually. I also struggle with sort of a hypochondriac version of it as well, where I have a fear that I have a lot of illnesses. So in 2013, because I had this generalized anxiety disorder, my anxiety just sort of kept ramping up as I was doing this show. We started off doing it 1 show a month, and then we ramped up to doing 2 a month. And when we did 1 a month, I would, for a week out of that month, have anxiety. And what would happen is, the shows were on Saturday nights, and on Monday mornings, I would go to our first writers meeting, and what I called my dread ball would arrive. And that was just right in the middle of my chest. It was probably about the size of a golf ball. And then as the week progressed, that dread ball would grow, and it would be like a melon. And if anyone has anxiety, it does feel like there's something in there that's stopping you from breathing. And then by the time Saturday came around and we were doing the show, it felt like I was inside of that dread ball. It was like a big hamster ball. If you struggle with anxiety, you know. A lot of times it feels like, those of you who are old enough to remember when TV would go off the air, do you remember the ants on the screen and the noise that it would make, that sound, right? That's kind of what happens to you when you're having constant anxiety, is there's a pane of glass between you and the world that has been created by this mental noise that's constantly happening. You're having all of these thoughts, and also your breath is really kind of what connects you to the world and what connects you to other people. And so when your breath is sort of stopped in your chest, you have trouble taking in information. You have trouble actually hearing people. I was the host of a show where I interviewed brilliant people, right? I interviewed Pulitzer Prize winners and Oscar winners and some of my idols. And the whole time I'm doing that, I have this noise in my head that I can't shut up. And so I would have trouble actually being able to engage in a conversation with them. And it really made my job a lot harder. But that show made me a writer. I mean, I had never written a comedy show, when I started doing it. I wrote essays every show, and I got to read them. So I wrote over 200 personal essays over the course of that show. And I met these people that I had admired for years, and I got to ask them how they did what they did. It was like this extraordinary, MFA program that just had a really good snacks in the green room and a band. And so there were tons of reasons why I didn't stop, but it turned into an untenable situation. It just turned into a situation that was so unhealthy, and what ended up happening was I had like a 2-day panic attack, and it was an OCD. It was essentially an OCD attack, and for the first time in a decade, I couldn't do the show. So I called my producer, and we found someone, Luke Burbank, who hosted a podcast in Seattle, was actually going to be on the show. So I said, why don't we just have Luke host a show? Because the whole reason we were having him on was to see if he could back me up if I ever got sick. And I got sick. And in some ways, I actually think my brain saw an out and sort of did this on purpose. Was like, here's your chance to get out of this situation. And the best and worst thing happened, and that was that the show was great. It was great without me. I think it's similar to when you have children, right? Like, you want so much for them to do well in the world, but you also want them to desperately need you. So I was really struggling with that, and I lost this amazing thing. And so I didn't want to lose a wonderful thing again, and I wondered, like, why my brain did this to me. And so I started writing this column called The Reluctant Adventurer, where I did things that scared me and I wrote about them. And in order to sort of process those experiences. And because I had anxiety, it wasn't like, I didn't jump out of a plane. I didn't bungee off of anything. I did things like I went to a sensory deprivation tank because I'm claustrophobic and afraid of dark. And I went to a professional cuddler. I also was on this like massive dating binge that year, around 28 first dates that year. And I went, as you do, to build your own burrito night at a sex club. So these are the kinds of things that I did in the book. And what came of it, what came of this column, was a book. And the book is called Okay, Fine, Whatever. The year I went from being afraid of everything to only being afraid of most things. That is a little bit of a spoiler. It was a humor book, but it's also intensely, deeply personal as a book. I talked about my worst OCD fears and my shame, and there's sex scenes in it that I star in. So why would I do that? Like, why would I write for over 300 pages about my greatest fears? And even further, how could I joke about them? you know? How and why does most of our greatest humor come from our darkest experiences? And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today, because that idea sort of fascinated me. This is sort of one of my favorite quotes about humor coming from a dark place. Why do you think there's, just anybody can yell this out, why do you think there's no humor in heaven?
Everybody's perfect.
Everybody's perfect, yeah.
There's no tension.
There's no tension. There's no shame. Yeah, that's true. A lot of humor comes from shame. I mean, the whole point of heaven, right, is that nothing ever goes wrong. So, you know, has anybody ever told you a hilarious story about a date that went perfectly? No. No, it's like, that's what we tell stories about. When shit happens, that's when the funny story happens, right? It comes from frustrations and sorrow and shame and anger and humiliation, right? Like, your most humiliating experiences are usually the funniest later. Not when they're happening, but later, right? It's comedy is tragedy plus time, right? It just depends on how tragic it was and how much time has passed. But so let's talk also a little bit about why do we want to make each other laugh? I mean, so much of it is about connection, right? It's about making us feel good and other people feel good. But there's actually some physical benefits to laughter. It releases endorphins. So endorphins are a pain reliever 10 times more powerful than morphine. So that's pretty amazing, right? It has the same exhilarating effect of strenuous exercise. So if you watch Catastrophe, you don't have to go to the gym. It increases oxygen intake and blood flow. And that oxygen intake sort of reinvigorates your cells. The immunity makes you less likely to get sick part of it is that you're laughing, and part of it is that you're happy and not stressed out. It improves relationships. So how many people have been in a fight with their partner and just screaming at each other? And there's a pause and somebody says something funny, and both of you just fall out into laughter. It is extraordinary. It's a wonderful release for relationships, and honestly, it's the only reason my Uncle Bob is still married to my Aunt Sandy. It improves any kind of relationship, whether it's a business relationship or a personal relationship, and keeps you from having to eat kale to be healthy. I haven't had kale in over 5 years, and I feel amazing. I don't actually. I feel terrible. I should eat more kale. And I should laugh more, but here's the kind of bummer about that. So, when you're a child, you laugh an average of 300 times a day. But by the time we reach the age of 35, between 15 and 100 times a day we laugh. I mean, that's a big bummer, right? But we all know why that is, right? This is what it's like to be an adult. Sometimes I lie awake and ask myself, where have I gone wrong? And a voice says to me, this is going to take more than one night. That's Charles Schultz. Right, so we grow up, and what happens? Things pile up, stress piles up, regrets pile up, financial stress, heartbreak, right? Heartbreak can last for a really long time and really affect the way that you see the world. Political stress. What if you're hypothetically find yourself living in an autocracy run by a 5-year-old in a terrible suit? What if that happens? Right? So we get angry or terrified, or as I did, anxious all the time. So how do we find humor in that? So what I did was that I looked at people who were really good at it. And there are tons of writers, and I know this is a writers' conference, so I should be using Lindy West or Sedaris or Samantha Irby, but I think that the people who do it all the time, every single day, they're writing on little notes, trying to find a way to make the world funny, is stand-up comics. So I use stand-up comics in my examples. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about how 3 different stand-up comics have done it in the way that you can actually do it in your writing. And ideally in your life. And 2 of these people have actually written books. So the first one is Aziz Ansari. And I know he's a little problematic. He had a creepy date, I guess, 2 years ago. But he's apologized for it, and so I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. And he's actually worked it into his work, and he's actually literally working on being more woke, I guess. Can I say that? Being more woke. About feminism and consent. So in any case, so Aziz, if you haven't seen him, he has a show on Netflix, and he does a lot of stand-up comedy. He plays a lot of big rooms. So what was he talking about in that clip?
Stereotypes.
Racism, stereotypes, right? Bias. Do you think he's mad about racism, stereotypes, and bias? He probably is. But what did his affect look like?
Comedy.
Approachable.
Manic.
A little manic, yeah. He has a sense of wonder about it. That's how he's chosen to look at this. And certainly, he may have times when he's alone and he's just yelling about this stuff. But in his art, he has chosen to take this stance. To look at it with bemusement, essentially, right? It's frustrating, it's confusing, but it's also kind of hilarious. And so I think that it's a smart choice. It's not just about what your work is like. Oh, sorry. It's not just about what your work is like. It's about what your life is like, right? So, do you think that it's better for him as a person if he's walking around really angry?
No.
Yeah. And then also, if you're going to a show or if you're going to see a speaker, are you more likely to hear them if they're yelling at you or if they're joking about things? Yeah, they're joking about things. And the thing is, you can still affect change coming from the stance of amusement. The thing is, Aziz Ansari has millions of followers. He's in stadiums with 50,000 people. A lot of those people probably do microaggressions during the course of their day because they don't know any better. But they're going to watch this, and they're going to see him talking about it, and they're going to get it. And he doesn't have to say, don't do microaggressions, he just has to tell this story. So I think that it would be better, right, if all of us walked around in this sort of state of amusement, largely because the world is hilarious. And especially now, there's so much going on that is so insane and feels so unreal that we have to find a sense of humor about it. But how do you get there? Sort of become aware that it's my thoughts that are creating my feelings, and my feelings are the lens through which I see the world. Which those of you who have studied Buddhism know very well. And as writers, right, we know this better than anyone else. We are constantly creating worlds in our heads. Either at the typewriter, I'm 80 years old apparently, either at the computer, or at the grocery store, or at a bar. So I've been working with Anna. She does, it's sort of a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy and Buddhism. And she has this group called the Insight Alliance, and she's doing this extraordinary work in prisons. And she's changed hundreds of lives, people in prisons who struggle with mental illnesses and who are racist, and she helps them sort of get rid of all of these beliefs and recognize that they are creating their world with their thoughts. So I started kind of taking these classes with her, and she talked about, one of the things she talked about was our internal special effects team. So you'll have a thought, right? And there are people who struggle with anxiety and people who don't. If you struggle with anxiety, your special effects team is always on, and they are fantastic. They're very good at their job. So you'll have a thought, and it just, maybe, your thought just sort of looks like this. But what happens is your internal special effects team gets a hold of it, and it sort of adds on, what you think. Your special effects team says, oh, here's what people think of you for thinking this thought, and here's where this thought might lead, right? Here's what this thought means about you as a person, right? And then you just hold on to it, and you cannot let it go because you've already attached all this stuff to it. And so what Anna teaches you is to just sort of, try to let go of that thought and recognize that feelings don't mean anything. They are just feelings, and they go away. I think we also think, oh no, I have this anxious feeling, it's never going to go away. No, that's what happens to anxious feelings, they do go away. And so I was taking the class, and I had this experience where I did a show called Speechless in Portland, and the whole point of the show is that you are asked to spin a wheel, and on that wheel you'll get something like a wedding toast, an HR presentation, a new product presentation, right? And then you're given 5 PowerPoint slides. And you have never seen the PowerPoint slides, but you have to work them into your presentation. And the audience tells you what you're presenting, right? And in mine, I got an awards presentation and the Westminster Dog Show. So I was a corgi. I was a corgi that had won and was a little obnoxious about it. But what happened was I went to drinks with my friend Shelley, who is the producer of the show. And we were just having drinks. I was going to see the show later. And she said, I just had a cancellation. Do you want to do this? And I had just had about 4 straight months of pretty bad anxiety. And I'd just gone on an SSRI that I'd been on it for a week. And it had actually significantly helped me. And so of course I said yes. And as soon as I said yes, if you have anxiety, you know what happens inside your body. You can feel the adrenaline, there's sort of tingling up in your chest, there's tingling in your extremities, your throat closes up a little bit, your heart starts to beat a little bit faster. It was immediate, and I couldn't believe that I'd done it. And she just went to the theater, and I was sitting there, and my boyfriend was supposed to meet me for drinks before the show. So I'm at the bar, and I know I need to get dinner and then have enough time to go to the theater and calm down. So I'm waiting for my boyfriend to show up. And I'm standing at the bar, and and by the way, also want vodka. So, because I don't recommend this, using beta blockers and vodka, but it's what I did at the time. Don't recommend it, it's not a good idea. But anyway, so I'm standing there waiting to get my drink, and that thing happens where you sort of get to the bar sort of at the same time as another person. And it was this guy, and he was in a sports jacket, and he was in a baseball jacket, and a baseball cap, and he was clearly with his friends, who he was chatting with and kind of getting their drink orders. And I was all by myself. And I don't think that he saw me, but I thought he started ordering a lot of drinks. And immediately, so I have all of this anxiety living in my body right now. All I can think about is how I'm going to fail. And all I can think about is how badly I need to get a drink and sit down. So this guy, and then he ordered a strawberry margarita. And I was like, what kind of douchebag orders a strawberry margarita? In my head, I began turning him into a terrible person, right? He just kept getting, orders. He kept getting the orders from his friends, not seeing me, not recognizing me. So what did that? He doesn't see other people. He doesn't recognize that there are other people in the world. He's not thoughtful. He saw me and he knew he was ordering 5 drinks. Everything and my anger at this guy just grew and grew, and I turned him into a villain. He was a person I had never met, knew nothing about, and he was a horrible person. He was probably, I don't know, maybe he golfed. I don't know. But you're not a terrible person if you golf. But then I thought about this class that I took, and I thought about the ways in which Anna talked about our internal special effects team and how we create our own stories. And I had so much anger at this guy. And when I thought about that, it drained out of my body. And some of the anxiety drained out of my body. But that anger was gone because I recognized that I had just created this person out of nothing that I knew. And then he actually ordered a daiquiri, and I got mad at him. So I was like, who orders that? Like, what decade are you from? But that was what was fascinating about it. It would pop up, I would remember that I was creating my world, and it would go away again. And this is what Aziz Ansari did, at least with this particular story, right? He created his world. He decided how to look at things. And that's something that you can do with your writing, right? Like you can shift your perspective and look at a story about your life in a different way. And it's gonna be more pleasant. So that to me was a very powerful moment. And I think it was something that I've since applied to my daily life, and it's not a constant thing. You're not going to be able to do it all the time, but you do it as much as possible. So this is Maria Bamford. Are you guys familiar with her? She has a show called Lady Dynamite on Netflix. But she's a stand-up comic, and she's a very unusual style, and she struggles with anxiety, bipolar disorder, and unwanted thought, obsessive compulsive disorder. And she talks about it in her comedy. So in her act, she talks about her OCD fears are scary. She has one fear that she is going to cut her family into chunks and cook the chunks and eat the chunks. It's bad, right? OCD is a terrifying disease. And she managed to she had a web series years ago, and she managed to make that funny. And she acts out her worst fears and her biggest shame sort of exactly as they happen. And the thing about, I'm sure everyone's recognized this, right? Like, what happens if you have a big secret or something that you're very ashamed of? And what happens the longer you hold on to it? Right? Yeah, it's like a tiny little snowball. And, and then it sort of rolls around in your anxieties, and then it rolls through like a snowbank of your fears, and then just a little drift of some negative stuff your mom said a week ago that you're still not letting go of. And then it's so gigantic that you can't think of anything else. But what happens when you get brave enough to tell someone you love or tell a friend about it? Yeah. It diffuses it. Yeah. So, it's so amazing, right? You'll just have this thing. It's just so giant in your head, and you'll tell them, and some of them are like, oh yeah, I did that last week. Or, wow, you know what? That's a bummer. Do you want a sandwich? I'm making a sandwich. And sometimes they're going to be like, you know what? Let's deal with this, because this is bad, But even if they say that, it still melts that giant snowball. And that's what Maria and I think thousands of other writers are doing. She's speaking her deepest fears and her OCD and her failures, and the laughter is what makes it smaller. I spent 10 years reading stories about my life and my shame in front of 400 people every 2 weeks. And I have felt like a freak for so much of my life. I was a virgin until I was 34, and I'm not Mormon. Not there's anything wrong with Mormons, but there's just a lot of stuff. I struggle with food addiction, and so I get up in front of all of these people. I told a story about the time I had a massive coughing fit and peed all over my boyfriend's floor of his kitchen. I told the story of the time I put a tiny little candy bar in my pants so I wouldn't eat it. That was the one where I was like, I'm losing them. I'm going to lose them. And then I didn't. Because what happens, and I recommend this to anyone who writes humor, always read it in front of a table of people. you want to hear people's reaction to it. And the thing about when you write a story like that, and you read it in front of people, something that you are afraid to tell, and you tell that story and you hear them laughing, that laughter is them recognizing themselves in you. And that is a tremendous gift to the writer. But my story was a gift to them too, right? Because if they're laughing, they probably felt like freaks too. So that situation made us all feel less like freaks, right? And I mean, through storytelling over 10 years to, small rooms, big rooms, I gotta tell you, like, we're all freaks. We're all freaks. And that's the thing. If we're freaks, if all of us are freaks, then none of us are freaks. And the more you tell your story to the more people, you learn that lesson. And you start to feel just like a human being instead of a freak. And that was the gift that show gave to me. And here's the other magic thing about what Maria's doing, is that when you tell a story like this live, so we talked about endorphins, right? And so they're not actually contagious, but when the audience laughs, endorphins are released in the audience. They actually have endorphins released in their body. And then hearing that laughter actually releases endorphins in the comic's body. So she quite literally took her pain and turned it into joy, which is a pretty amazing trick to be able to do. And I think that we've all seen, right? Like, the effects of writing our stories is almost never negative. There's almost always something that good that comes out of it. And she's made a career out of it. And so this one's Mike Birbiglia. Mike, he's an author and a stand-up comic and a storyteller, and he's been on This American Life, and he's written a Broadway show, a book, and a movie based on this one-man show, and I'm going to play you a little piece of the show that's been animated by somebody on the internet. So that could have gone a completely different way, right? Like, I have a friend who got lost on a mountain. He went down the wrong side of a mountain snowboarding, so he ended up in like 3-foot snow thinking that he was going to die that night. And he spent so much time obsessing about that experience that he can't ski anymore without having an anxiety attack. He actually has trouble being away from his home, right? But so Mike actually says in the story, my greatest fear of my entire life. Right? This was my greatest fear of my entire life. But if somebody asked Mike, how'd your fishing trip go? What could he have said? Fine. Right? He could have said it was awful. Like, we almost died, right? Like, that's what he could have chosen to tell, and that could have been the story of that trip. But because he's a stand-up comic, and because that's the way his brain works, his answer was, oh, kind of a funny thing happened on my trip. And what that's called is reframing.
This place called Keynote.
So, are you guys familiar with cognitive reframing? Anybody here a psychologist? Yeah? Yes, or anyone who's done a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy. So it is a psychological technique that consists of identifying and disputing irrational or maladaptive thoughts, a way of viewing and experiencing events, ideas, and emotions to find a more positive alternative. That's the definition of cognitive reframing. And they use it a lot. Psychologists tend to use it with people who have PTSD. And it's a way to, you're never going to change what happened to you in your life. We all know that. But what reframing does is that it helps you to see that experience in a different way. And that's what writing does. So for Mike, like, he's been a comic for all these years, so it just comes naturally to him. But how can you start to do that with your own stories? So if you have a story that's about shame or humiliation, or for me, the first thing that I do is I try to figure out what I got out of that story. What I got out of that experience. Like this story of me having a coughing fit and peeing all over my boyfriend's floor, that became the story of the first time he ever saw me as human. We've been dating for like 3 months, and it was, you know how right around 3 months you're not lying technically, but you're just like putting on your best face. You know, he met all my friends, and you know, I seemed really cool, and I had a cool job, and then I peed on his floor. And it was like, this is it. This is the first time I can't hide my humanity from you. And he just thought it was funny. And you know, I was like, he's never gonna make out with me again. That's so gross. And then we totally did, right? So this humiliating story is actually kind of the sweetest story of our relationship, right? The story of sticking a candy bar down my pants. That story kind of, it turned into a story of me kind of fighting my demons, doing whatever I needed to do to fight my demons, and also an illustration of how we never know what people's battles are when we kind of, you know how you judge people's grocery carts? Like, you don't know how people are struggling. You don't know what they're doing. Like, oh, she's not even trying. Look at all that. Look at all those Malamars. Oh, she's trying. She put a candy bar down her pants so she wouldn't eat it. So what I try to do is look back at the experience, start with kind of, well, what did I get out of that experience? And sometimes you don't know what you got out of it until you start writing about it. And then also, what I tell my students when I'm teaching a class is like, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of this in writing classes, but just you've got to look at your experience like a scientist or a cop. You know, what happened? What were the facts? What did you smell, taste, touch? And once you did that, like, look at what Mike Birbiglia did with all of that information once he looked at the experience like a scientist. You know, he noticed the bear's affect, right? Which is very subtle. He noticed the tone of his sister's voice, and he played off of that and magnified it. He noticed how ridiculous it was that he was, you know, begging a bear to come attack him, and he, you know, used the metaphor of putting a condiment on his head, right? So once you have all of these facts and you notice, okay, here are the things that I really noticed, here are the things that were really interesting about this story, then you can actually play off of that and find humor in it. And the great thing is, the more you do that, the more perspective you actually find. You know, metaphors are amazing to me about sort of finding perspective and really recognizing like how messed up a story might be. One of my favorites is actually Luke Burbank, the guy who took over for me. He told this story about he and his wife were trying to have a baby. And they went to a friend's house, and their friend had kids, and the dinner was miserable. The kids were just running around constantly. They were interrupting all the conversations. They were screaming. They were both just so miserable, and they got in the car, and they both just, oh my God, thank God we don't have kids. That was terrible. But then they went home, and she was ovulating, so they had sex. And Luke said, it was as if we were standing on the shore, watching our friends being eaten by sharks, and putting our wetsuits on. Right? And there's something so satisfying about a good metaphor, right? It really gives you perspective on what's happening, right? So just figuring out a way to look at your stories in an objective way, and the more distance you can get from those, it actually, just even trying to think of it in a scientific way can help you get perspective on it. So that kind of, I think what's cool about memoir is with reframing, you can do a rewrite on your life. And I don't mean that you can change things or exaggerate things. I mean that you can change the way that you look at it and realize what you got out of it. And so the time that I peed on my boyfriend's floor, I felt a lot like I felt when I threw up in 3rd grade. You know, when you think about those experiences, it's astonishing. You still physically feel how you felt. Your stomach starts to hurt a little bit. And my stomach doesn't hurt when I think of that story, right? The story of my boyfriend's kitchen has changed for me, and it's no longer a story that literally does not bring me physical pain or shame, because it's now a sweet story. And I think that as nonfiction writers, we sometimes feel like we don't get to do that magic thing that fiction writers get to do, where we create a world. But in a way, I think the way that we can do it is actually kind of better because we create this magic of essentially changing our own lives. Like, we can't change the experience, but if we're made of our histories, right? And we find a way to see a story of our life in a different way, then we are quite literally changing our life. And that's kind of about as magical as it can get, right? So that's the part of it that's very exciting to me. And I spent a year doing things that scared me and writing about them. And every single time I wrote about an experience, I learned something from it. And oftentimes I didn't know what I had gotten out of it until I started writing about it. And the moment when you find what Cheryl Strait calls the universal truth of your story, that's a gift to the reader because that's how they see themselves in you. And it's a gift to you because that's when you recognize your own humanity. So after a year of doing that, I'd love to tell you that my whole life changed. But change is incrementally frustratingly slow. But what I will say is that one thing changed, and that was one word: interesting. So when I would think about a task or an activity that in the past I would have said, well, that sounds terrifying, I would say, well, that sounds interesting. And just that tiny little shift was enough to change my life fairly significantly. So my advice to you is to always remember that your thoughts make your world, and that sharing your vulnerabilities will diffuse them, and that you're not a freak, unless you like raw kale. And then there's nothing I can do for you. So I don't know if we can take questions.
No, let's do 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, if anybody has any, I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh, and there are some of my books over there, so if anybody wants to buy them, I will be happy to sign them. No?
Oh, one right here.
Oh, yeah, hi.
I did notice when you were no longer on Livewire.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, where did she go? So this is good. But what are you up to now? Are you...
Well, I'm still kind of trying to, the book came out in July, so I'm still doing book events. I went to Tucson last month and Tucson Book Festival, and so doing stuff with that. I've been writing a column for the Mercury for a while, and then I work part-time at an ad agency as a creative director and writer, just to kind of keep things going. And I'm writing a pilot based on the book. I've had a couple of meetings. Everybody has meetings. So I've had a couple of meetings, and so I'm writing a pilot to see if something might come of that.
But no stand-up comedy. Right?
No stand-up comedy. No, I can't believe people do that. It's terrifying. Or interesting. It's interesting. Anybody else? No? Awesome. Thank you so much. Bye.